I'm going to start this video by showing you a clip from Expel, who recently reacted to one of my own videos, and I think you need to see this. Quality improvements that were really good. But within the space of 10 hours, you...
Holy schmoly, did you see how fast he got obliterated by the guy on his right while he was shooting at the guy up top?
really notice all of the stuff that's gone missing, and if my testing's anything to go...
And the guy up top killed him.
What? It means a number of QO out.
What is the desync on that? Oh my god, it didn't look like that at all on his screen. And the guy on the side didn't even shoot him on his screen.
Just
what
haven't
the
made
hell?
cut, and probably won't until maybe. If your experience with Warzone under Black Ops 6 has been the same, you're not alone. Instantaneous deaths, hit registration not working properly, being killed behind cover or around corners has become so prevalent in this version of Black Ops 6's Warzone that I had to look into what in sweet hell was going on with this game. I've had instances of no registration with bullets at all, I've had instances where I've died very, very far behind cover, and I've even had instances where I die seemingly instantaneously. So if this has been your experience, or you're curious about the inner workings of Warzone's server system under Black Ops 6, join me again for another deep dive, where I go into how everything's occurring, and how this situation for Warzone is not looking particularly good. Because from what I found, and from some of my testing and from some of my evidence, we are looking at what could be a really messy situation for the future of Warzone under Black Ops 6. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please do drop a like and consider subscribing. We're on the road to 200k subscribers. And these deep dives generally involve a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of testing to make sure that I'm bringing you guys as accurate as information as possible that I can to the scene. If the clip I just showed you with Expel feels familiar, it's something that a lot of people refer to as server desync, where someone dies really quickly or something just looks like it wasn't the case, and the experience between one instance of the game and another instance of the game feel radically differently. That's because of how video games work in terms of sending data between your console and your PC to the server, because the game itself actually takes place on the server. All of the information about your movement, your kills, your damage, the amount of damage you've dealt to an opponent, whether or not you've registered a kill, all happens on the server side. And it's the job of any modern first-person shooter to communicate information between your game and the server to make sure that what happens on your screen is an accurate representation of what happens in the game and in the server. And the amount of information shared between your system and the server is registered in what's known as tick rate. So 10 Hz, for example, is 10 updates per second between your client and the server sending data back and forth between each other. So when you get these desync scenarios, it's likely that something has gone wrong in that pipeline. Either connectivity or your internet has created an issue that information and packets of data aren't being sent or received properly, or there's something wrong with the game and the actual server system it's using itself that isn't creating an accurate representation of Black Ops 6 and Warzone. This clip in the background that I've shown you from Expel actually features two examples of server desync. The first one is the instantaneous nature at which my character dies. And when you look at the kill cam, which is supposed to be a recreation of what the server saw, it looks like the opponent shot at me for a fairly ample amount of time, and it looks like the time to kill that he's experienced seems correct. But the time to death and how quickly I perished felt absolutely alien. It felt almost instantaneous. And that's one example of desync, and I'll explain the more nuanced details of that later in this video. The other one is that Expel notes that he thought I was shot by the second player. And the reason he thought I was shot by the second player is because another example of server desync, which actually was previously fixed, I believe, in the last year by Call of Duty, but seemingly has been unfixed, is that the character model is facing the wrong direction. It looks as though the second person vaulting the wall to the right is looking at me. But if you go back and watch the kill cam, that was never the case at all. He actually just vaulted over the wall and ran away from me, and didn't point his gun or character model towards me in any way, shape, or form. And I've got loads of clips and examples of this, of me running around a corner and still receiving damage, and I end up dying. But I honestly don't feel I need to show you loads and loads of clips of this, because I feel like a lot of what I'm saying right now is resonating with you. And if it is, do drop a comment down below and let me know your experience. Because the server desync in Black Ops 6's version of Warzone is so enhanced and so intense that even to the naked eye and general perception of you looking at the video game, something feels off and something feels wrong. So why is this version of Warzone having so many troubles? Well, I recently covered Black Ops 6's multiplayer server situation. And like I mentioned before with server tick rate and updates, Black Ops 6 uses 60Hz servers, which is considered to be pretty good for the industry. There are other more competitive shooters like Valorant and CS, which have historically used 128Hz servers to give better accurate depictions and more competitive environments, but 60Hz is not bad at all, and it is a pretty solid industry standard. Even so, Black Ops 6 was experiencing trouble, and I will say, for the time being, that seems to have greatly improved. So it's extremely likely that in the case of Black Ops 6's multiplayer server situation, that even though the client and server were sending perfectly good amounts of data between each other and trying to create an accurate depiction, the amount of demand and amount of players playing on those servers meant that the server situation degraded. And I think this is what we would call dynamic load shedding. Now, chances are Call of Duty has had to scale up lots of new servers, and all of these servers will have different CPUs, different infrastructures. Some of them will be more powerful than others, and some of them may run into issues. And during my testing for Black Ops 6's multiplayer, you could see, even in a 60Hz environment with an industry standard of updates, that the game was having trouble, including a 30% visual difference between time to kill and time to death, where time to kill refers to how long it takes for you to kill an opponent, and time to death is how fast you die when you receive damage. So if you were to kill somebody, and let's say the weapon damage gives you 800 milliseconds of time to kill between firing your gun and finishing the opponent, the time to death value that that player would experience would be 30% faster. So if the time to kill was 800 milliseconds, the time to death was something closer to 560. And that's in a 60Hz server environment where things are supposedly operating fairly well. Well, in comes Call of Duty Warzone. I tested every single server, pretty much. Every server within the United States, every server within Europe, every server that I could basically get myself into without causing any major problems. And I found that every single one of them is running at 20Hz. I said prior to the integration of Black Ops 6 with Warzone that if Call of Duty didn't invest in higher tick servers and better communication, that you would be adding extreme movement to a game that doesn't have the infrastructure to support it. And that is 100% the case, and we're seeing it unfold right now in Black Ops 6's iteration of Warzone, and we're seeing players' experience ultimately pay the cost for that. So that 30% difference between time to kill and time to death in Black Ops 6 multiplayer, where the environment is 60Hz, could effectively be twice as worse in Call of Duty Warzone. And this doesn't change from mode to mode or country to country. The servers for Resurgence, the servers for Big Map, the servers in the US, whether you're East or West Coast, or the servers in Europe, are all fundamentally operating under the same core design philosophy of 20Hz, which is 20 updates per second between the player and the server, which creates these massively large discrepancies between your movement, the gameplay, the gunfire, the damage, and the death. You see, the issue is, and this is generally the main crux of all of this, is that Black Ops 6 and Modern Warfare 3 ultimately have very similar movement speeds. The amount of actual distance you would cover while sprinting from one point to another is identical in those games. But what is different is the amount of physical movement your character experiences. You are likely sliding more, changing direction more, you are capable of sliding backwards, forwards, and sideways, and your character is exhibiting a larger degree and axis of movement than it has in games like Modern Warfare 3 and Modern Warfare 2. And you can very quickly shift from going in one direction to another almost instantaneously in this game. And all of that information about your movement, and also the information of the bullets being fired at you from opponents, has to be communicated in the server infrastructure. It has to be communicated from one player who's an enemy to the server to another player who is also playing the game. So you're going to see these huge discrepancies where someone's time to kill and time to death is radically different, or someone gets killed behind cover substantially more, or what happens on screen doesn't seem to be what happens in-game. And as covered in my previous mention of Black Ops 6's multiplayer, the same situation for lag compensation also applies in Warzone. Call of Duty favors whoever is firing bullets versus the person who is receiving the damage. And what I mean by that is that if the person firing his gun has a really high latency or a terrible connection, the person who's receiving damage is still going to receive all of that damage, even if it looks like they were behind cover, and even if it looks like they're physically out the way. And the clip you're seeing in the background of that discrepancy where the shooter has a bad connection was in a 60 Hz environment. The perception of that is even worse when the environment is 20 Hz. So dying around corners and dying instantaneously is just a fact of life of Warzone at this point. The other big issue that these low tick rate servers produce is something called super bullets, which actually explains a lot of these clips that I've shown you about dying instantaneously. Now, when a company ultimately cheaps out on their server infrastructure or cheaps out on their general netcode for their game, what you get is a bit of a mess. And if it's ever felt like a high rate of fire weapon, like the XM4 or a really fast firing SMG, is giving you better kills and better hit registration, that's not false. That's not you being inaccurate. That is actually what occurs server-side as a result of a phenomenon called super bullets. This chart in the background illustrates what super bullets looks like, which is the damage of multiple hits sent in one update. Now, in Call of Duty Warzone, the updates are 20 Hz instead of 10 Hz, so there are more updates between bullets in some scenarios. But Call of Duty also features substantially higher rate of fire weapons, so there are going to be some weapons in the game where this phenomenon is exactly what I'm talking about. And what this means is that when you're firing a really high rate of fire weapon, the damage of multiple hits, so multiple shots that you have sent, will arrive to the person receiving them in one update instead of multiple updates, which creates this huge discrepancy between time to kill and time to death. So in the case of COD, where some guns work at RPMs of 900 or 1000, they are sending multiple damage hits in one update, and you as a player on the other side of things will receive all of that damage in one update. And that's why it's called super bullets, because it's as though you suddenly got insta-killed by some kind of god gun, when in reality, it's just because the rate of fire of the weapon and the amount of damage it's trying to transmit over the server is physically faster than what the server is updating in real time. At the bottom of this chart, you can see how 60 Hz servers deal with some of these issues, because there are more updates over the space of time that damage is dealt, meaning that there is a more accurate representation of what's occurring, and it gives you as a player more time to react and more time to experience the damage that is going into you. But with Call of Duty's 20 Hz servers, that just fundamentally isn't the case. And these updates that I'm talking about, the 20 Hz, the 10 Hz, in this case 20 for Warzone, applies to pretty much everything that happens server-side. So your character's movement and your character's location, the damage that's being fired, the amount of damage that's being dealt, all of this stuff happens server-side. So all of these clips you're seeing of players dying behind cover or players dying instantaneously is just a byproduct of ultimately cheap networking. Now, the reality is, and I'm going to say this here and now, Call of Duty has no excuse. I am 100% doing my best to be objective about Call of Duty. I know generally that these updates are difficult. I know generally that integrations and all of the amount of work they've had to done to meld Black Ops 6 into Modern Warfare 3 requires a lot of development. I also know that stuff like audio is far more complex than it appears. Granted, I do think Call of Duty uniquely is probably the only first-person shooter I can think of that struggles with it so much, but it's still a challenging thing to do. And the same generally, to some extent, does apply with networking. But what I will say, and this is just a fundamental fact of the industry, is that Call of Duty is being cheap, and they could pay for better servers with higher updates, which is what they do in their premium product. And it's not like Warzone doesn't make them money. Granted, and this is just an objective fact of server infrastructure, supporting more players on higher tick rate servers on multiple servers is more expensive. If you think of a Black Ops 6 game where it's 6v6 or 5v5 or whatever it so happens to be, running multiple instances of those games on one server providing 60 Hz is expensive, but it's only 6v6 and you can do it for a large number of players across that small player count because the games themselves aren't super demanding in terms of calculations. But for Warzone, you're talking 120 players in some instances, and you're talking about 120 players connecting, sending data. You're talking about all the calculations that have to occur during that one game. Complexities like vehicle physics, movement, streaks, whatever it so happens to be. And historically, in the past, I actually made a video which demonstrated that Call of Duty's old servers for Warzone 2 were likely being massively destroyed by the amount of AI they were spawning on the map, because they chew up resources. Artificial intelligence generally requires calculations. And Call of Duty actually ended up deleting all of the AI off of their servers because they probably recognized the same thing. Warzone is a highly played game, and it means that fundamentally, supporting higher refresh rate servers will come at a cost. However, Fortnite does it. Apex does it, PUBG does it, and Fortnite is arguably played substantially more than Call of Duty Warzone. At an industry standard level for a first-person shooter, 20 Hz is just basically unacceptable. Competitive shooters have started branching into the realms of 128 Hz or 256 Hz, but other battle royales are doing 60, and for Call of Duty Warzone to operate at 20 Hz objectively is just a failure. Every other battle royale in the industry, every other first-person shooter that takes its fan base and its audience seriously, has moved to high refresh rate servers. Even Battlefield 2042, which had far more physics than the average game of Warzone, with things like destruction, tornadoes, even though the game was arse, that's besides the point, supported 128 players with all of that physics in 45 Hz servers, which is double the refresh rate of what Call of Duty is currently offering. The reality for me, and I think this is the biggest problem, is I actually don't see a scenario in the future where Call of Duty's movement system for Black Ops 6 can work in a Warzone environment when 20 Hz servers are the reality. It doesn't matter if you're sliding in and out of cover and utilizing movement to keep yourself safe, if the server hasn't physically updated fast enough to register that, and you still end up dying behind cover. That's about it for this video today. And generally, I think at the moment the situation after this integration is a bit of a mess. We're talking about a server infrastructure that's outdated and antiquated, and you're combining it with other things like TTK problems, random attachment issues, random issues with bugs and desyncing servers. And it's no surprise that sentiment to this update has been so negative. I actually think the ceiling for Call of Duty Warzone is extremely high, and if they fixed certain things and paid attention to core fundamental parts of the game, they would be in a phenomenal spot before Verdansk releases. But they actually have to do that, and so far, I'm unconvinced. So folks, make sure you drop a like on this video, drop a subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next one.